Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to episode 11 of xEssentials, Controller Selection, Option and Features by Dave Spalding. Dave, go ahead.
Hello, some of you know me. I've been doing animated lighting since 2005, started with LR, switched over to Xlights in 2018. Used several different platforms, several different controllers over the years. And there's a correct controller for every use and a non-correct controller for every use. This presentation will actually show you more of what types of controllers you'll need to be looking into for your display. Task conditions and standards. Sorry, I've got military background, so my presentations all come out the military style. The task is to select the correct controller for your lighting display. Conditions: you are given Xlights and a completed layout and props. Complete measurement of your displays. You're needing to select the controller or controllers that best fit your needs. The standard would be to select a controller that best fits the needs of your design, display, and props. Things to consider before you start selecting a controller. You want to know if you want to run your show in Standalone, Xschedule, or FPP. You'll want to know how many frames per second you plan on running your display at. You want to have your current layout and also be thinking about future expansions that you want to do to your layout. You'll want to keep in mind the distance to all your props or your other controllers, as that'll play a major factor in what controllers would work best for your display. You also want to look at the types of props, lights, or effects that you have, DMX, pixels, AC lights, DC lights, servos, just a big long list. And you also want to make sure that you're keeping your budget in mind. And we'll drill into each one of these a little bit further, just to kind of explain what would work best for you. So with Standalone, Xschedule, or FPP, Standalone, the controller will operate by itself. You don't have anything else connected to it. You send all of your files to the controller, and it'll operate on its own via external timer to turn the controller on, and it comes up, or you go in and program the controller to come on at a specific time. If you are running a single controller, you don't want to utilize or tie up your current computer, this is actually a good choice for you. Standalone is actually a very, very good feature. I've used it before. I try to play around with all the different features to see which ones I like the best. One of the other choices is Xschedule. If you're using Xschedule, your computer will output E131 data to your controller and operate your controller that way. Xschedule can also mimic FPP. We'll get a little bit more into that when we get over to FPP. So essentially, the Xlights team has done a great job adding all the controllers that currently are compatible for easier use to your Xlights. That way you can upload to your controller, and it can control your controller a lot easier than the way it used to when I first started with Xlights. Makes it set up and driving it a lot easier. FPP, it utilizes to run your show with a Pi or a BeagleBone. A lot of the controllers that are out there now, like the Colt boards, run with a BeagleBone on them. There's also Pi hats that you can add 2 Pis to control pixels or servos, or you can drive panels with BeagleBones and Pis. Very, very useful type of controller. They operate in Standalone. You can set them as a master to drive the entire show. You can run them in remote mode if you're running another master, if you're utilizing a Pi, or if you're running 2 BBB controllers, 2 BeagleBone controllers, you can use one as a master, the other as a remote, and you don't have to have a separate Pi or BeagleBone to drive your show. And they can also be ran in Standalone. Frames per second. So pixel controllers have a rated frames per second, also known as millisecond timings. They will drive before the auto derate. So if you have your show sequenced at 40 frames per second and your show is only built for 20 frames per second, it will derate at the controller down to 20 frames per second and will not appear the way that you thought your show was going to appear. 40 frames per second is also known as 25 millisecond timings. This will allow the controllers to drive less pixels per port at 40 frames per second, but if you have a keen eye, like a lot of people do, you can actually see that the frames per second will actually make a difference, make your lights flash differently. You can get them a lot closer to timing marks at 40 frames per second. 20 frames per second is also known as 50 millisecond timings. Normally, it's the maximum rating on your controllers that you're looking at to use. It's the total amount that the board will drive when they're advertising a board. So when they tell you a board can drive 1400 pixels at 50 millisecond timing, they're saying that controller will drive 1400 pixels at 20 frames per second. The frames per second does change how your show appears when outputting to your lights. Like I said before, if your show is built for 20 frames per second, but it's sequenced at 40 frames per second, you can be looking at your show on your computer playback and then be watching the lights and they will look different. Current layout and expansions. You want to build your Xlights layout before you select a controller. I know that's backwards in the way that we have been doing it, but I have found that it alleviates a lot of buyers' remorse and frustrations. They're not buying, that way you're not buying a controller that won't do what you had imagined in your head that it would be able to do. So you want to have your current layout of how you want your show to look set up, and then you'll want to start looking into what you will need for controllers. This will tell you how many pixels that you're going to need to control doing this way instead of trying to make a show fit around a controller or controllers. It also helps give you the total number of pixels. That way you can divide it down to where if you're going to be running by prop and have multiple controllers operating your show, or if just one controller is going to be operating your show, it'll let you know before you start spending a lot of money on hardware if your show is actually going to work correctly. Distance to props and other controllers. The rule of thumb that I've always used and I've always heard other people using is to plan 30 feet max from the controller to your first pixel without having an F amp or null nodes in the line. You also need to decide if you're going to go wireless or hardwired or both. Sometimes a wireless connection would work great if you have a small prop a little bit further away and you don't want to have wires running down your house to where you only have to get power up to it instead of having power and data running to both. You also want to look into, it'll let you know if you need to have differential receivers or transmitters. That way you can reach further away since pixel data rule of thumb is 30 feet from the controller. A lot of times the transmitter receivers, I've used both. They work great if you have to run a prop a long ways away from your display. One controller versus using multiple controllers. So this is one of the biggest things that I've seen lately. People are putting all their eggs into one basket and hoping that it'll work for their show. They'll buy the controller they think will work and then find out it doesn't operate the way they thought it did, and it will only drive so many pixels because of expansions versus how many pixels they're trying to drive if they're running matrices or a lot of other props that are high density. So with high dense props, it may behoove you to actually have multiple controllers. It may be cheaper for you in the long run as well. Types of props, lights or effects, DMX, pixels, AC, DC, etc. The reason you want to look into this is you want to know how will the DMX, AC, and DC, etc. be controlled. Is it going to be ran from your computer? Is it going to be ran from your controller? Are you going to be running a lot of devices near each other? Are you going to be running devices spread all over the place? Are you needing to use a DMX board or translator in order to run the DMX equipment, or can you just output regular DMX to it, or are you going to need a DC converter? Are there any devices close together or far apart? And are they near pixels or near controllers? If you have AC, DC, DMX, they actually make controllers that will operate off of pixel data. So these controllers will connect inline and convert pixel data to either DMX, AC relays, servos, DC. There's a lot of different options. You don't have to have like an LOR, a dongle, and multiple controllers around. If you have a couple items you need to run in one area, you can add this board in, it'll convert that pixel data back and give you several channels off of pixel data. So you can run your DMX, you can run your AC or your servos or DCs. Budget. You need to make sure that you're figuring out a budget for your light show. When I first started getting into lighting, I went way overboard, bought pallets upon pallets of lights, a whole bunch of controllers, and I was hurting because I spent way too much money on it without actually tracking what I was spending. You don't always have to have the most expensive controller. It may not be the one that works best for you. It may be the best controller for you. If you're needing UL listed, they are higher priced due to the cost of the testing and certifications. There's only a few of them out there that are UL listed and they're commercial controllers. Some states, it's a huge requirement for professional installers. You need to make sure you're checking with your local codes if you're looking at installing lighting commercially. If something were to happen, your state requires UL listing or your local code requires UL listing, that could be a very big problem and very expensive for you. So X-compatible vendor controllers. The easiest way to find out, because I see people post all the time in threads asking what controllers are compatible with Xlights. If you're running Xlights, if you just add Ethernet, then it'll pop up a controller. You click on vendor, and then click your drop down. It'll give you a list of the vendor controllers that are currently supported. This is a screenshot from an older version of Xlights, but they constantly update. So if you're staying up to date on your Xlights, the list will constantly change. So when you're getting ready to pick a controller, I always draw out your plans on your layout. You can either do it nice and neatly or do it like I export it to a phone and then I start writing on it with different colors, different symbols, so I know what's going where. As you can see in this example, I actually have my longest run marked out. That way I know this is going to be the longest run from where I want to keep my controllers for that run, which is right up here. So that's an F16V3 that's actually powering 3 matrices and then the house. I'm actually switched over to new controller, so it runs off differential receiver boards. It's an F40 PB, so it is a bigger bone. and it will actually run to every one of these differentials to power these lights in the pond. The differential receivers power all the lights around the pond. The F16V2 was controlling the tree. The F16V3 got moved out to control it. So I'll be putting an expansion on the F16V3. With expansions, you always have to keep in mind that expansion does not always mean expansion on boards. Some boards, it's actually a division board. It gives you more ports, but it divides up the amount of pixels per port. So if you, through a slider or automatically, it'll chop it in half. You definitely want to do your research with the vendors. So if you go on a thread and post, I need a controller, what's the controller to get? If you haven't gone through and actually looked at your layout, figured out how many pixels you have, how many controllers you're going to need, then that may not be the question to be asking yet. Get your layout done first. That way you can actually physically see how many lights you're going to have and how far your runs are going to be, so you can actually figure out if you need multiple controllers. I also did this layout on with an old setup before I had started buying some new boards. So I do have some DMX 30s. The DMX 30s can actually operate all these lights. Used to be DMX. Everything in the pond was originally DMX, and I had changed over. So I'm actually adding the differential receivers. Here you'll see I actually drew out how many ports. Differential receivers normally have 4 ports. So with those 4 ports, you can see I'm not actually using all of them. They can be used at a later date to possibly put props in here. That's where my future expansion is. Future expansion would be over here off my trees, where my other F40 is at. If you see, I draw several different pictograms. Anytime I have an expansion, I'll usually draw a block with a line down the middle, so I know that controller has an expansion board on it. So you can see it's on the tree because it's controlling the tree. Put an F4 out here to actually run the lights and to drive a Pixel 2 AC board that runs pump motors. I also have F4s driving each matrix because I wanted to up to 40 frames per second from 20 frames per second, and an Alpha Pix driving a 25-foot by 18 rows by 125 pixels. And then the differential receivers, I planned on 4 off of each port. I always leave extra on every controller that has a differential port. That way I can add further expansions if I need to, or I can use it for DMX, depending on the type of controller. So there's multiple layouts, multiple ways that you can do with multiple ways you can do things to plan for your show. I do have multiple mobile layouts. I do several of them. This one is one that I do locally, and I change this one every time I set it up. And it's because I have different controllers. I try to reuse what I can where I can. So to run this, there's 250 nodes just on each side of the pickup. Sorry. There's 250 nodes on each side of the pickup for the outline, and then 50 across the front. So this 50 is actually divided 25 across the front. So I got 275 nodes per side. So to
plan for something like this, I also have to look into how am I going to get power? How am I going to get everything to the trailer? Do I want a controller in the truck? Do I want a controller on the trailer? The tree's 36 strands of 100 each. So do I use a controller? Do I daisy chain up and down? The more thought you put into it before you start looking at controllers, the more options you actually will have. So the way that I ran this layout the last time, if I can get my so I had one controller with expansion running my tree. Then I had an F8 running the truck. That way everything was close. I didn't have to worry about pixel runs because down below here, these are pucks that actually shine on the concrete. So there's 30 on each side of the truck, and I cannot connect pixels before or after the pucks. They have to be on their own. I could horseshoe them, hook them together, but I wanted to keep everything as individual as I could. So with the F8, I actually had one port driving the reel spinners, one per wheel. So that's 4 ports. I had one driving each side of the truck. That's 5, 6 ports. And then I had one driving each row. That's 8 ports. So I ended up using all 8 ports, no power injection, because I stayed under the 300 pixel rule. With my spin reels, I actually power balanced, and I was also running at 10%. For the trailer, I used an F4 that actually drove the spinners on the wheels, my arches, and the 2 mini trees and the outline. So all my arches were hooked together all the way around the trailer, one port, my 2 sides, which was 3 ports, and then my 2 spinners on each side were linked together as well. Looking back, I would actually link my spinners into each side just to save ports, have extras. Is there a different way I could have drove this? Absolutely. I could have used an F16 and ran everything from back by the tree up to the front. The problem that I was looking at was having multiple wires moving around a vehicle with moving parts and a parade. Didn't want to get anything tangled up, and that's why I went the multiple controller route. So I was actually running wireless on this setup. So I actually had a Wi-Fi router that I had placed in the middle, and it was sending signal back to my F8. My F4 was hardwired, and then my F16 was hardwired into the wireless router. So I was hitting that from my computer inside the truck back to that router to power the entire show. All right. The other thing that you can use controllers for, if you want to use controllers just on a prop level, a lot of people use them on trees. This is actually a build I had done for a customer that wanted to have, they had specific guidelines that I had to follow. So the unit had to be able to run in standalone. They had to be able to connect to it via hardwired and via Wi-Fi. And they had to have each arch on its own channel. So the only choice I had for this specific build, there's 16 arches on the top row, 16 arches on the bottom row, 32 arches total. They wanted wireless, they wanted Wi-Fi, and they wanted it to be able to operate in standalone. So that told me exactly what controller I needed to have. So if you have your prop built first, it makes it easier to pick. This one, I could have ran a Falcon on it. I did end up using a BeagleBone, one of the clipboards on it. The only reason I could get away with this commercial build not being a UL listed controller where this fountain is located if it is not attached to a physical structure that people can enter and exit. It does not have to be UL listed. That's where going in, checking your local code can actually save you customers a few dollars. Plus, with this setup, price point was key, and with the price of that board for all the options that they were wanting, it was actually the best option for me to have. If we wanted to break this down and look at it as which other ways that we need to build it, you could actually use an F16 to power this and connect your two arches together. That way the power going out, power coming back. The only issue I would have is there's the top arch goes all the way to the bottom. It had to go all the way to the bottom. They want it to look like water. But there's no right way, there's no wrong way. I always just recommend that you build your display, build your, have your prop at least drawn out and start figuring how many pixels. Try to get rough measurements, know exactly what you're going to be driving so you don't end up buying a controller that won't power exactly what you're needing.
Okay, David, if you want to go and look for that, we'll go and close out this session of xEssential.